Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. And today I'm speaking with Roger Montoya, the New Mexico State Representative for District 40. We'll get to Roger after just a few short announcements. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we are conducting this show on stolen Tewa land and to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of that land. I also want to tell you that last week I spoke with Rena Sapansky, the Chief of Staff for Speaker Egolf, and now the candidate to replace him in House District 47. I also want to remind you that if you're driving around and miss any of today's show, you can watch the full YouTube recording of this show and any prior interview by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on the Retake on the Radio button on the right side of the homepage, and you'll find all the YouTube recordings of all of our previous shows. So you don't have to just listen, you actually get to see us talk. Wow. With the session over, Retake is beginning to focus on the looming primaries. So we'll be hosting interviews with candidates who are facing primary challenges. That focus began last week with our interview with Rena and continues with an interview today with Roger Montoya, and then with interviews with Representatives Susan Herrera, Andrea Romero, and Cristina Ortiz. Our website at retakeourdemocracy.org will soon provide a page identifying candidates we support and how you can support those candidates. Retake learned a lot in the last session, and one important lesson was that you need to initiate advocacy much sooner. And so we have initiated a range of proactive strategies to prepare for the 2023 legislative session. Seems like we just finished 2022, and indeed the special session is coming, but we're preparing for 2023. This involves working closely with key allies and legislators to cultivate interest, understanding, and support for policies we support and hope will be introduced as bills. This education work will include collaborating with allies, presenting at interim hearings, and working directly with legislators and training constituents to meet with legislators and support the cultivation and education efforts. If you want to get involved in this work and help us frame and advance these strategies, please just join our monthly huddle on Zoom. It's the second Wednesday of every month from 6 to 7:30. Join our Retake community. Our next huddle is on April 13th from 6 to 7:30, and you must register for the huddle by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on the actions and events in the menu bar. A description of the huddle and link to register appears near the top of that page. So stay tuned and stay involved. Enough announcements. Let's get started. Welcome, Roger. Thanks for taking time for this.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be with you.
I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So how about we start with you telling us a bit about yourself and how you got involved in policy and ultimately in politics in general, and then why you wound up running for District 40.
Absolutely. I am almost a lifelong resident of northern New Mexico and an ancestral native. The district that I humbly serve includes Rio Arriba County, Mora, San Miguel, and Colfax, a vast area of about 6,000 square miles. I'm an artist, I'm an innovator, I'm a public servant, and I really see myself more as a conductor in an orchestra than a political leader. By that I mean, I see my local leaders, the constituents, the opportunities, the challenges as members of the orchestra. And if we can balance and honor the voices and the tone, we can come up with a harmonious outcome. So it's a rather interesting metaphor, but it's one that helps me get through what I see as a very challenging political process. The reason I ran for office was because I wanted to leverage 30 years of dedicated community service through nonprofit work around education, food insecurity, helping the homeless, and mostly advocating for young people and their families. I felt that with that base of knowledge and history, it could be very informative in the political arena to bring the voices literally to the fore instead of a top-down policy-making strategy. I hope I answered your question.
You did, and I hope our listeners are able to sense the depth with which Roger means this. I just was writing about him for a blog coming up, and I said he gets justice in his gut, not in his brain. Not to say that you don't have the brains to tie it all together, but it's not something you just read about somewhere. It's something you feel deeply, and that transmits very clearly. You've been involved in 2 sessions now. What would you identify as your greatest accomplishment in those 2 sessions?
Listening to the rural voices and the needs, and devising a rural task force. As a freshman, I don't know that it's happened too often, and it was a difficult path, but the Rural Economic Opportunity Task Force is in its 2nd year, and it's really designed to look at equity from a rural perspective with water, wastewater, roads, bridges, electricity, and broadband. My vision is that if we don't have an equal playing field, we cannot raise the social determinants of health around education, economic development, healthcare access, or anything else until we have that built environment. And it's an investment that can take 10 or 20 years. So I am very proud of that achievement. It required that I pull together the Republicans, the Democrats, the moderates, the independents to find a lane of purpose that really drove home the need. And there's where we found this balance to work as one.
Sort of pulling together the orchestra, as it were.
You got it, toning it, and finding a way to say, let's put the wedge issues aside, put them on a shelf or maybe in the compost, and let's focus on humanistic values and therefore the needs that emerge. Who doesn't need, good connectivity for broadband? Who doesn't need clean water and conservation kinds of approaches to how we look at our environment, our schools, healthcare, public safety, and so on?
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about the rural committee and about the conference that's coming up. But first, I just wanted to ask you, that's your biggest success or the thing you're most proud of. What would you identify as your biggest legislative disappointment?
The biggest surprise, and I knew it was there, was the division between the parties and how hyped up it is and how corrosive and destructive it is to the very spirit of a citizen legislative body. As a freshman walking in and seeing the Republicans pushed to the side and, over here, and we're not supposed to ever commingle and honor the humanity of our colleagues, that to me was deeply disturbing and still is, because while I am a devout Democrat and I have very progressive ideas, I also realize the practical nature of our work and who we work for and why. And so that construct of division was simply the most disappointing for me and still remains.
Okay. Yeah, it surprises me also. It's just like that, and it comes together in a lot of ways in the last days of the session when Republicans, talk for 3 hours on the floor while important legislation is just sitting there. And that's the way they address it. I had a conversation with Damon Eli once about 4 years ago, and when I was saying, can't we do something about it? And he goes, we got to be careful, because if we're in the minority, it will be the only tool we have to stop bad ideas. So I suppose they think that that's what they're doing. But it just seems to me, wouldn't it be nice if the legislature was really there about just trying to pass bills, and let the votes determine which bills get through and not who can talk for 3 hours about baseball.
I really believe that it's the interim committee process in the summer where we could get that work done, where we could arrive at the session with, say, 10 or 15 bills that we have built as a unified team, so that we have flow and the people and the constituents gain respect and hope again for the process, because it's utterly wasteful. I totally agree.
Yeah, we're going to be more involved in the interim process than we have in the past this year. And I think you're right. That's where like genuine conversation comes around. You've been recognized for your work with at-risk youth. How has that work informed your work as a legislator?
That's a beautiful question. And it grounds me, because that work of serving young people and their families has been the most motivational and purposeful of my life. They're the future, literally. And to see their talent, however raw or however challenged by trauma and poverty, to me as an artist, again, it is a great canvas to paint, or to help paint with these young lives, to find a way to find their resilience, to nourish their soul and their spirit, to heal, and to identify a critical pathway forward of lifelong education that's not necessarily higher ed or a doctorate in this or that, but it's a purpose for living that I think is lost in the way that we have composed humanity today, that we don't have that connection. So that work has absolutely informed, and I keep going back to that when I judge bills against that, whether it's environmental or tax law or education. How will it read and serve the young people and their families in my beautiful, beautiful region of 6,000 square miles? And so it's a litmus test for me to make sure that I'm on point, and that I continue to be aware and humble that my decisions and thoughts are linked to the people.
Okay, you mentioned a little bit, that's a great answer too, Roger. One of your bills in your first session was creation of the Rural Economic Opportunities Committee. What has that committee done so far? Or has it just gotten started?
I am so proud. We toured 4 cities during last year's, or townships. We were in Chaparral, Mora, Gallup, and in Taos. And we created a study. We have a 166-page rural sort of a blueprint for legislation. And it's on my website at roger4nm.com. And it has an in-depth look at the gaps, the opportunities, comparative studies to Texas and Colorado and Arizona on how their rural citizens navigate things like clean water and getting their roads and bridges fixed and broadband, because the rural setting across America is vastly different from the urban. And that's really what drove the intentionality of this task force. I said, if we have all of these standing committees focus on rural issues, and there were 4 in statute, then why is rural New Mexico in the state that it is? I had to pass it as a memorial, because people in the Senate did not see it as a valuable tool. So I pressed, and I was encouraged by the willingness of Brian Egoff and the leadership to say, okay, let's make it a 2-year task force. So to answer your question, we now have a study, which is a blueprint for legislation, and we've already begun to use it.
All right, well, Retake will begin to use it as soon as we get off this interview. So thank you for that work. I see that you have a statewide rural conference coming. What is that about?
It's built off of the same philosophy of rural equity. What I have noticed most, and it's so glaring, that because rural leaders and regions lack the GRT in the population center, we are denied, we are forgotten with funding and services that are commensurate with the population we do have. And so I decided to pull together a statewide rural summit before the interims, with the distinct intentionality to bring policy recommendations across 6 sectors to the top of the pile, so to speak, of all of the interim committees. It's something that never happens. And it's something, frankly, that David Abbey remarked when I did a smaller version during the redistricting in December. We had 71 rural leaders from my district, District 40, and it didn't matter if they were Republican or independent or whatever. they sat and they talked about the inequity of infrastructure. And we devised a bill, House Bill 173, directly from that work. And David Abbey said, Roger, when it ended, that was remarkable. If the interims had that kind of connectivity and honesty and camaraderie, regardless of where these people are situated politically, the interims would have a better purpose and outcome. And I was charmed by that because he was right. And he saw the value of the good work. So this rural
He's not a
summit,
bad person to have on your side either.
David Abbey is a gentleman. He is seasoned. He is thoughtful, and he's helped me tremendously. So this rural summit is coming up on May 12th and 13th, 2 full days. It will be sponsored in part by the 33 Counties Association of New Mexico, the Municipal League, various tribes and organizations, coalition of healthcare think tanks, because rural access to healthcare is one of the most critical, glaring gaps that I see.
Will it be available by Zoom or will it all be in person? And where, if it's in person, where will it be?
It will be in person and it will be virtual as well. There will be a Zoom component. It will be held in the House chambers and 6 of the largest meeting rooms in the Roundhouse, the People's House, right? I really wanted to see that instead of having the legislators sitting in their seats and pontificating from on high, that these frontline leaders in small townships and unincorporated villages and champions really can take those seats and help us understand what the priorities actually are from their perspective. Policy has to meet the people. In my 1.5 years in the body, I've seen that a majority of the policy reads beautifully and it flows and it seems like it's fantastic, but it does not permeate the roots of rural New Mexico in a way that's meaningful. And I see that, again, the rural work and the task force and the study and now the summit, they all have the same intention: to bring equity through voice, honesty, integrity, and really a love for the state. It's very, people call me a Pollyanna, that I'm just too, I don't know, in my head and too much of a dreamer. And I argue because beauty matters. And if we can inspire the best in humanity, regardless of party, and really focus on what's needed, then it's worth it, especially when we have an abundance of money. $8.45 billion that we passed collectively in the last session is astounding and historic.
Yep. Okay, well, we got to take a short break here to remind our listeners that they're listening to KSFR. And KSFR is more important than ever these days in an age of misinformation, disinformation, and flat out dishonesty. You get the honest scoop at KSFR with great news, Democracy Now!, Retake Our Democracy, and other shows, Show from Somos and Pueblo and Nido. All of these things allow you to get information about local culture, local music, local history, and local politics. So if you want to, this doesn't come for free. It may be free to you, but they have staff and engineers that they have to pay. And if you want to help support that, after you listen to this show, just go to ksfr.org and click on the donate button and look at a $10 or $20 donation as your ticket for admission to some great programming. Please do that too. I'm not just squawking. That's really important. You get what you paid for. Okay, let's get back to Roger. What frustrates you most about the New Mexico state legislative process, and how has this played out in impeding passage of good legislation in the past? Boy, talk about a wide open.
That's a big question, sir. And I think what rises to the fore is, particularly for me as a rural legislator, I know it's different for the urban. We have the same amount of constituents, so approximately 30,000 that we must serve. But in my district, it covers 6,000 square miles, 10 municipalities, 27 unincorporated townships, 4 separate counties, 1 tribal. As a volunteer expected to pay for gas and food and lodging and just the very care of my body and soul to do that work is an insult to legislators. We are the only body in the United States of America that does not compensate in a professional manner its legislators. There is a direct and distinct correlation between the status of our health on every list, from childhood well-being, educational attainment, economic development, and on and on. So that's been a real, I've been taking notes. I am a humble public servant, and I happily move out into my district regularly, and it is a chore. It takes me days. When I decide to go to the other side of the district, it means a hotel and at least one night stay to hit 3 cities or townships. So it's an investment of time that takes me away from my life and paying my own rent and my partner and my little dog. And so that's the most frustrating to me. And it doesn't make sense that all these decades have passed and the New Mexico legislature has never successfully addressed this. It tells me one thing, that the rich, the resourceful, are the only ones that, or retired, are the only ones that can play. We lost 2 incredible young women this year. One resigned and one decided not to rerun. And they were Albuquerque based, and their voices and their experiences were so valuable, so outside of the box of the usual lawyers and so on and so forth. And I think it's directly linked. So I'm sorry for the long-winded answer, but that is the single most sort of lacking, if you will, in the legislative process that I've seen. I'm sure that we would get much better outcomes if we honored our elected leaders.
So we're going to drill down a little bit on that, because I know from talking to you before, you use some of your own funds to pay for a chief of staff. How does that resource facilitate your performing your legislative duties during the session and between sessions?
Wow. I have a chief of staff, and I've been laughed at more than once by my colleagues. Who does he think he is? And he is a chief of staff. I said, well, I'm a community organizer, and I see this as an orchestra. You need all the players. And so I deploy volunteers. I have interns from college programs that come back with their own funding. But I have a chief of staff because our people deserve it. And I pay him in a variety of ways. Some of it is through my fundraising. Some of it is volunteer-based on his part. Some is an old school bartering where he takes paintings and we continue our good work because he's absolutely dedicated and the highest caliber that I could have found. I have no idea how lucky I was going to be when I met him, and he's been invaluable. So it's my wish that I can take that real life experience and data and how important it was to be able to, as an example, capital outlay. We received $1.6 million for our entire district. I had $245 million in requests. These were prioritized by the district. I was able to use my team to meet with every single township and thoughtfully consider every need and come up with a proportionality and an equity that is unmatched. These are the words of the constituents out there in the real world. They're saying, we've been ignored forever. For 40 years, we've never had anybody even give us $50,000 or $100,000. And I made a point to use the taxpayer dollars and not my dollars to make sure that people were heard and served. And it's beautiful. That's my favorite part. It's a little bit like Santa Claus. But the bigger overarching piece is that with staff who are competent and carry my values, we can drive the equity that we must bring to our people.
We're getting near the end of the radio show. We'll continue this conversation on YouTube for our retake folks on the website. But I do want to give you an opportunity to let people know how they can get in touch with your campaign and what you need from us. You certainly give to us. What can we do for you?
The biggest opportunity a listener could provide is a donation, a contribution to my campaign. They can do that by going to roger4nm.com. That's rogerfornm.com. There's an ActBlue portal, or you can send a check to Roger for New Mexico, and that would be at Post Office Box 546, Velarde, Velarde, New Mexico, 87582. And really, prayers and goodwill. And I mean, it sounds hokey, but I believe that when intentionality is clear and good work is happening, there's a certain magic that happens in community, and people are inspired, people are hopeful, and people begin to understand their role as stewards in citizenship. And that's what I'm seeing in my district. And it fuels me like no end. It's a beautiful thing. It balances the rather challenging nature of the Roundhouse itself, because it's in the field of service that love is really shared. And I'll be as hokey as I need to be.
Yeah. Well, hokey is good as far as I'm concerned, because it comes from a depth of feeling, and that's very obvious. I hope our listeners were able to gather that through the radio waves. I'm sure that when you watch it on YouTube, you'll be able to see the sincerity that emotes from Representative Montoya. So we're out of time for today. We'll be back next week. I believe we're going to be speaking with Susan Herrera. And in fact, I know we'll be speaking with Susan Herrera because I've already recorded the show. And so that will be next Saturday at 8:30 a.m. on KSFR 101.1 FM. And thank you for listening. Stay active, stay engaged. It's the only way we fix this mess. We'll be back next week. Thank you. Okay, we can return by the miracle of YouTube and continue this conversation with Representative Montoya. You had been talking about how you had used your capital expenditure funds and how you engaged your constituents in that. The governor certainly made a statement in vetoing the junior bill allocations, which are reasonably similar. Do you think she had a valid point? And if so, how could she have made that point without ruffling so many feathers? She sure did that.
I think ultimately she had a valid point. There were certain line items that had troubling language or a non-clarity as to how they would be sustained or completed. And I think that what ultimately happened, we had a lot of drama, and we still have some, was that those line items were sent to each legislator, and we were able to make those course corrections and then resubmit. And that could have happened very simply and honorably, but instead we were accused of being unaccountable and that we didn't plan well, and that's what set me off. As a volunteer citizen legislator, we know our people, we know the needs, we listen carefully. And taking those, I come from nonprofit. So you give me, $360,000, I can make that stretch in the most beautiful way and be accountable. And so that's really what was the motivation. And I pleaded the night before I sent out my letter to the press with her staff to be reasonable and to talk to me, and they just did not. And so I hope that this upcoming special session, that we will put that behind us and reinstate the complete bill, every penny, and that this gas rebate or this sort of motion to bring relief to New Mexicans will come to fruition as well.
Yeah, it's needed. Well, thank you for that. Going forward, would you like to maintain a junior bill option available to fund initiatives that weren't included in the budget initially? And if so,
Absolutely.
how would you amend the process to address the governor's concerns?
I definitely believe that the junior bill, and any time that we have discretionary funds that are monitored and within guardrails that are really prominent and clear, because after all, we have to be 100% transparent, that we would have a better outcome. the problem that I see right now, if you're not on the House Appropriations Committee, or you don't have a secret way in to get an ear, you have no way of getting any of your projects into House Bill 2, unless you pray a lot or do something else. And so if we had the
It's not the
ability,
first time we've heard that, by the way.
yeah, if we had the ability to be surgical, to be thoughtful about the needs and gaps that really exist, then I believe we would have a much better outcome. Case in point, I put forth a bill called House Bill 173. It dealt with the notion of crisis intervention for infrastructure. And by that, I mean, certain leaders have issues that arise that are indeed crisis, not emergency, that would be FEMA, where a pump goes out or a flood happens and they need critical capital. They don't have a reserve and they need it done exponentially. That was the focal point. If we had discretionary funds, we could quickly bring remedy to clean water systems and health care and things that are just dire in a rural setting, that where if you're in an urban area, there's plenty of resources around. It goes unnoticed. So that's one way that I think if we could rethink the process, not just give us a small pittance, give us a real amount and the transparency to work with our community and show that to the public and the leadership so that the money arrives. You know, all this talk of billions of dollars and it never trickles down. That's what my constituents say.
Yeah. It seems to me that there ought to be a protocol that could be developed and a template that legislators use that outlines who they've met with and why they think this allocation makes sense and what they anticipate as an outcome from it. And if every legislator had that same tool to report, this is what I want to expend my funds on, I agree with you. I think that the money doesn't trickle down, and legislators who meet with their constituents regularly have a very good idea of where the money can have the biggest bang. And,
exactly. And perhaps that would inspire legislators to more uniformly get out into their communities. What I'm told by about 4 of my colleagues, you work too hard, you're making us look bad, don't do so much. You know, nobody does that. And I'm like, how? Why? How can we not visit and understand the complexity of rural life if we're the representative? It's like a no-brainer to me.
A lot of things that are no-brainers to you and to me don't seem to be no-brainers for others, unfortunately.
Agreed.
Maybe there's no brains going on there. What are the values and principles that guide you in determining what bills to support or oppose? You've pretty much woven that through the whole conversation, but how about just in one snapshot?
Policy must meet the people. If we listen accurately and intently, we will know where to move from a policy standpoint.
Okay.
That's the litmus test.
That's succinct and a good litmus test, I would agree. You're being challenged in the primary. Who is your opponent and why should District 40 voters continue to choose you as their rep?
My opponent is a gentleman, a young man named Joseph Sanchez. He's an engineer. He's going to be married soon, going to have a family. He's a perfectly fine human being, but he's a ladder climber. He saw an opportunity after just a year and a half in the role that I now hold in the House to run for Congress. He was not successful and now wants to come back, and these are his words, to claim his seat. It's the people's seat, first of all. So that's one distinction. I do not believe, and these are the words of my leadership across my district, that he has the sense of duty to actually do the work day to day. Their words were, we never saw Mr. Sanchez in our community until he wanted to vote, or I don't even know what he looked like. And when he asked us to endorse him, I said, we are quite happy with Mr. Montoya. He's kind, he's effective, and look at the list of things he's done. I'm not a promiser. I'm not a campaign slogan. I'm going to improve education. I'm going to protect traditional communities. I have already done that for decades. I will simply continue because now that I'm in the mix, I am sharper, I am more committed, I am more awake and determined to deliver. And frankly, I get goosebumps right now just saying that, because the people I interface, they inspire me to come to the communities and find small ways to solve a small problem and get them to find a sense of joy and hope, because from that small kindling, a bigger fire emerges, and suddenly we can handle the septic system, or we can handle the roads or broadband, and there's this camaraderie. It's the orchestra again that starts to find the harmony and the beauty of real leadership. Mr. Sanchez is a stargazer. He's looking for the next opportunity for a position, and he is not a public servant. And I say that with the greatest respect to him. He doesn't have the maturity and doesn't have the correct motivation for public service. That's the simplest way I can state my thoughts.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. We're going to move on and talk a little bit about some bills that were introduced in the last session and or could be in the next. And I know none of these issues are now framed as bills in 2020 for 2023. So that, you know, we're talking more about concepts and issues than we are the specific bills. But what I'd like you to do is I tick off each one of these, just say support, strongly support, oppose, need a lot more information, something like that. And then we'll circle back and have a little bit of a conversation about the bills, some of them. So here we go. You ready? All right, public bank.
Support, need information. I see great value in the potential.
Health Security Act.
Absolutely support.
Hydrogen hub.
Big pause. I do not believe it's ready for prime time. It may have what it takes, but again, listening to the people's response in a 6-hour debate was all I needed to hear. Tribal, environmentalists, citizens, scientists. There were about 150 people that never got to speak in a 6-hour session, and that was enough. It's not ready for New Mexico.
Okay, well, we would agree on that one. How about a study of public power?
Wow, a study of public power. That sounds like a deep novel. Sounds like what I'm invested in right now.
Well, we're talking about energy here, not power as in political power.
Oh my goodness.
Although that would be a good study too.
Sure would. That's a deep well. A study of public energy you're talking about? Absolutely. We need to look critically at how to move forward. You know, the passage of the ETA in 2018 was a good direction, but we've got side railed with things like hydrogen and blue hydrogen and green hydrogen and all this. Why not just stay with simple wind, solar, building that transmission line, the battery storage issues? For Christ's sakes, we have labs sitting in every corner of the state. Why aren't we deploying a unified focus on that instead of being distracted by $8 billion here? And I don't know. It's a policy decision, and it's a political season. So maybe that was the motivation.
Perhaps. But we're agreeing again. This is getting uncomfortable, Roger. Universal basic income study.
Absolutely. I think equity on how we, especially now that I'm an in the field public servant in a rural setting, equity matters. And so, yes, I'm in absolute support.
Okay. Tax credits for electric vehicles and rooftop solar.
Oh, yeah. That's the way of the future. I do want to speak, and I'll probably get a chance on oil and gas and, you know, extractive industries, but yeah, yes.
Yeah. And just FYI, one of the things Retake really looks for in those bills is ways in which to structure them so that they can benefit low-income working families, as opposed to just people who can afford to throw some solar panels on their roof and get a Tesla. You know, it needs to come down to, you know, working people.
Absolutely. The notion of economic justice rings true. They're a set of words, but what it boils down to is that, again, it has to be litmus tested against the poorest and most vulnerable subset, or I'm not going to even listen, because it's too top heavy, it's top down, and it works in the urban areas, very glamorous and seems great, but it does not pass the test for rural New Mexico in most cases. And so that's something I'm very strong on.
All right. Thank you for that. Let's shift gears and look at the global effort or non-effort to address climate change. The IPCC just released yet another report on the state of the planet, and is even more dire than the last dire report. The window is rapidly closing on when the world can stave off the worst of the consequences coming from warming climate. New Mexico is sitting in obviously a difficult spot, in some ways a microcosm of the international situation, because we have an outsized reliance on oil and gas revenue to sustain our budget and our way of life. But at the same time, that revenue is coming from drilling in the Permian Basin in northwest New Mexico. And that comes with a steep price in terms of the future we are leaving for future generations. Environmentalists and some legislators have sought to find a way to either put a pause on drilling activity in New Mexico, or to diversify our economy substantially so that we're not as reliant on gas and oil. Neither of those initiatives have really advanced very far. Do you see a path forward where we can reduce our reliance on gas and oil and start to wind down our drilling activities? And if so, where does that begin? And I want to make sure our listeners understand that we realize this is a really difficult problem. You can't just shut off the valve if it's what's feeding all of the great initiatives that Roger's been talking about.
Yeah. Wow. Great question. Very deep question. I want to frame it, first of all, from a nationalistic perspective. The price we pay for oil in America is determined by the world oil market. We will never be able to really find energy independence or security if we stay dependent on oil and gas. Now, I do want to say that I'm a rural leader, and I have evolved, and I believe that to just simply move away from extractive industries like this, when a third of our budget right now is dependent on it, that $8.45 billion budget that's a major chunk. Again, a very thoughtful transition that has measurable and meaningful pathways towards that end. For example, I read recently that Exxon in southeastern New Mexico near the Permian Basin is installing or has installed a massive solar array. Now, if a company like Exxon can find the inspiration as a corporate giant to invest in an array of that scale, maybe there's hope. Maybe there's a way for a voice like mine that is really listening to all of the constituents. I mean, I'm halfway to Clayton now. I've got Raton. I have very conservative voters and people who live and depend on industries that maybe people in Santa Fe or Bernalillo don't have to care about. So I'm thinking more broadly that if we can find the motivation as a body to see climate change and the realities that are there, they're absolutely there. That water is the most precious. People say el agua es la vida, and it seems like a bunch of words, but it is critical, beyond crisis, that we address that. But at the same time, we have to find a way to tune the orchestra and not just blare the trombones or the flutes get out. We have to bring the minds and hearts together to have an honest conversation. And part of the problem nationally and internationally is that the corporate voices and the control for money is so overpowered, and then it trickles down to the parties. And then we can never have an honest discussion about what's really happening to humanity and this dependence on oil and gas. If we had that conversation, I believe, maybe I'm naive, that we could find a pathway that is productive For example, why aren't we focusing on wind, solar, battery storage, the transmission lines that will make us an energy exporter for the Southwest? I mean, why are we distracted by hydrogen? And I don't get it. I think we should narrow our focus, keep our eye on the tiger, honor the oil and gas industry. And I know I may get like shot for saying this, because it is critical to our future in that we find a way to transition. And I don't know if that makes any sense or now if I'm your least popular guest, but I have to say that because that's really where I'm sitting. And it's a big conflict, especially on the House floor when you're looking at bills, and there's incredible pressure to siphon through the information and come up with thoughts and votes that really are going to be the best for our state and our nation and the world. If you have any additional questions, please ask.
Well, you haven't lost me yet, Roger, not at all. I thought that was a thoughtful response. It's not an easy situation, and sometimes some environmental groups tend to make it almost sound like the other side are just morons or something, or only interested about money. The latter may be true. The former is not. And, we just need, like you said, we need to, and regardless, I don't have a lot of fondness for the gas and oil industry, but there are a whole lot of folks in your district and in other districts in McKinley County and down in southern New Mexico that are dependent upon that industry, and their livelihoods matter, and the transition has to be a just one. And it may not be that they ever go back to wells and drills again, but they need to be transitioned to a dignified life and a way of earning a living as part of the package. It can't be, an afterthought. And I'm sure you agree there.
I totally do. There's this contention that's built into that kind of a discussion when we're opposed, and we can never find a fluid place of reason and thought and action that makes sense for New Mexicans on this issue. So I'm hopeful. I'm still hopeful that if I'm reelected, I can have some incremental influence on this discussion, because it's
you need to become the conductor,
important.
dude. You need to be the conductor.
I hope so.
So we can kind of make those bass drums that pound all the time a little more subdued.
Well, if it's not too ambitious for me to state, there is an opening in the speaker's position. I'm a newbie, but I think someone like me who positions himself in a central position without the extension cords plugged in, if you know what I mean, I think that would be incredible to see the body less contentious, us and them, and maybe just this way to say, we are human beings here to serve. Let's do good work. Let's find the heart and love again and make New Mexico a leader in the world on how we govern.
That would be sweet. Well, we're going to be working on different ways to reform the legislative process, and we'll definitely consult with you about that. And so we need conductors. But thank you very much for being with me today, Roger. And for the YouTube listeners, how about if you tell people again how they can get in touch with your campaign?
Please, if you're interested in supporting my campaign to be reelected on June 7th, go to roger4nm.com. There's lots of information about my legislation, a transparent look at all of my capital outlay and junior money, if it's still there, at rogerfornm.com. Muchas gracias.
Okay. Well, thank you for being with me and for participating in such a long interview. It was very interesting.
It was wonderful. It always is. And I commend your work and your dedication. It's inspiring.
Okay. Well, back to you. All right. Thanks, Roger. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.